Welcome in, everyone. Today, we're diving into the world of IT. Well, more specifically, how to keep technology from, becoming this overwhelming thing in our lives, and instead make it work for us,
Mm.
not against us.
Mm.
We've got a stack of articles here from a company called Bythors. It's Bythors, in case you're taking notes.
Bythors.
Yeah, and they're pretty upfront about trying to, sell their services, but there's still some pretty interesting points throughout their material. So, ready to unpack some of these ideas.
Absolutely. And, one thing that caught my eye was how they use this image of an iceberg to show, like, the hidden costs of having these overly complicated IT systems. So you see the tip, right? It's like the slow loading times or, the occasional software glitch. But then underneath, that's where all the real problems are hiding. Operational expenses, those delayed responses, and even potentially security risks. And those are the things that can really drag you down.
It's kind of like when you think you're just doing a simple home improvement project, just sprucing things up a bit,
Right.
and then you realize, oh, wait a minute, this is a complete structural overhaul. And then the question becomes, where do you even begin to untangle that mess, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's where Bythors is really smart because they advocate for simplification as that crucial first line of defense.
So it's about stripping things down, getting back to basics.
In a way, yes. Think of it this way. Every time you add another layer of complexity to your IT systems, it's like putting another digital Band-Aid on a problem.
Okay, like that.
And each of those Band-Aids might seem like a small cost at the time, but they add up so fast, both financially, of course, but also in terms of your overall efficiency.
Oh, absolutely. I actually just spent days, I'm not even kidding, days trying to fix this one little glitch in my smart home setup.
Oh, no.
And it turned out to be a conflict between two different apps. It's like, talk about a hidden cost, all that time wasted, and my sanity, let's be honest.
Exactly. And now imagine that on a much larger scale, because for businesses, those hidden costs, those are translating into real financial losses. If your IT infrastructure is a tangled mess, think about all the time, all the resources that you're just wasting trying to keep the lights on, let alone actually innovate or scale your operations.
So then how do we even begin to simplify these like giant complex IT ecosystems? Because Bythors mentions these low-hanging fruit strategies. What do those look like in practice?
It's about identifying those quick wins that can have a surprisingly big impact. And they have this retype, resize, remove strategy that they talk about, which is a good start for sure. Though honestly, I think it's just scratching the surface of what's possible with optimization.
Right, because just deleting some old files, that's not going to solve everything.
Right.
But it's probably a good first step, right?
Yeah.
Just decluttering a bit.
For sure.
Kind of like clearing out your inbox before you dive into this massive, complex project.
Absolutely. Because if you think about it, that retype part, it's basically looking for opportunities to move data to a storage solution that's more cost effective. So for example, if you've got all this data that you rarely ever access, you could just archive it instead of keeping it on these high performance servers, which by the way, are not cheap.
Okay, that makes sense. So that tackles the where of data storage.
Yeah.
But what about the how much part of the equation?
That's where the resize comes in.
I thought so.
Because so often you have virtual machines, you have databases that are way bigger than they actually need to be. And just by downsizing or optimizing them, even a little bit can free up a surprising amount of resources, and it can even boost performance. And you don't have to do this complete system overhaul to see those benefits.
It's like realizing you've been driving around this gas-guzzling SUV when really a fuel-efficient sedan would have done the job just fine.
Yes, exactly.
And suddenly you're like, oh, wait a minute. I could have been saving all this money this whole time.
You got it. And then, of course, there's that remove part of the strategy, which, well, it's exactly what it sounds like. Getting rid of all the unnecessary digital clutter, obsolete backups, applications you don't use anymore, inactive user accounts. Those things pile up so fast and they eat up resources without you even realizing it. It's like a basic digital hygiene, really.
Right. Just good digital housekeeping. So we've talked about these quick wins, which are great, but what happens when you're ready to go beyond just tidying up a bit? What if you want to build an IT infrastructure that's truly future-proof, something that can scale and adapt as your needs change over time? Because that's where things get a little more complex, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about a much more strategic approach now. It's like, if you're building a skyscraper, you wouldn't erect that on a shaky foundation, right?
Yeah.
And that's where this idea of long-term consulting and really diving deep into what they call scalable architecture becomes super important.
Okay, so less about spring cleaning and more about like designing a building that can actually grow and adapt over time. So, I mean, Bythors definitely seems to be hinting at their own consulting services here. But what are some of the key elements of this, like, scalable architecture they keep mentioning? What does that even mean?
Well, and they're smart to focus on it because it really is essential. One key concept that they highlight is this shift from monolithic applications to what they call microservices.
Microservices, okay.
Yeah, so imagine for a second that your software is like this giant cruise ship, right?
Okay.
It's powerful, sure, but it takes forever to turn, to change course, to adapt to a new route.
Makes sense.
Microservices are like having a fleet of smaller, more agile boats. They can all move independently, they can navigate on their own, but they can also connect and work together for those bigger tasks. So you get all this flexibility, all this efficiency.
Oh, I like that analogy. Okay, that makes a lot more sense. So instead of this one massive piece of software, you have all these smaller interconnected components. But how does that actually translate to building a more scalable IT system? How does that work in practice?
So each of those microservices, it handles a very specific function.
Okay.
And crucially, it can be scaled independently of all the others.
Oh, interesting.
So let's say one part of your application is suddenly experiencing this huge surge in demand.
Okay, yeah.
Well, instead of having to scale up your entire system, you just scale up that one microservice that's under pressure.
Oh, wow.
So you're optimizing your resource allocation and you're saving money in the process.
That's incredibly efficient.
Yeah.
And I imagine it would also make troubleshooting and updates a lot less disruptive, right? Because if one microservice has a problem, it doesn't necessarily bring down the whole system.
Got it. Exactly. So not only is it more scalable, it's more resilient too. It's about creating a system that's as adaptable and responsive as possible.
That's really smart. And then Bythors also mentions serverless architectures alongside these microservices. Is that just a fancy way of saying everything's in the cloud, or is there more to it than that?
It's a little more nuanced than that.
Okay.
So serverless doesn't mean there aren't any servers involved, obviously. It just means that you're not the one managing them. So imagine like you have this team of expert chefs just on standby, right? And you only have to pay them when they're actually cooking your order. You don't have to pay them to just stand around during downtime.
Okay, so you're essentially outsourcing the management of your server infrastructure.
Exactly.
And you only pay for the computing power that you actually use when you need it.
Exactly. Which is a game changer for businesses, especially those with like really fluctuating demands, because it means they can scale their resources up or down like in real time without having to worry about, oh, do we have enough server capacity? Do we need to do all this maintenance? It's already taken care of.
It sounds amazing. I feel like for businesses that have those really seasonal spikes or just unpredictable traffic patterns, this would be a dream come true. But I imagine there's got to be a certain level of, I don't know, complexity involved in actually transitioning to this kind of setup. It can't be as easy as just flipping a switch, right?
Right. And it's not always a simple swap, right? It often involves a degree of what Bythors calls consolidation. And that can be a pretty big job, but it's one that ultimately can make your whole operation so much smoother.
So it's about streamlining your entire IT ecosystem to make sure it's running as efficiently as possible.
Yes, exactly. Think of it like decluttering your digital workspace, right?
Yeah.
Because companies, especially, I mean, they end up with this hodgepodge of different systems, especially after mergers or if they've gone through a period of rapid growth.
Sure.
So consolidation, it's about merging what you can. It's about getting rid of redundancies and just moving towards this much more unified infrastructure.
So it's like finally organizing that drawer full of tangled cords and adapters that we all have.
Yes.
That we're all guilty of.
And you might even unearth some hidden treasures along the way.
That's true. That's true. So a well-consolidated cloud environment, it reduces your overhead, it simplifies things, and I imagine it also probably strengthens your security as well.
Absolutely. Because when everything's unified, it's much easier to implement consistent security protocols across the board and to monitor for those potential vulnerabilities.
That makes a lot of sense. And speaking of security, there's one term from our outline that we haven't actually touched on yet, and that's DevSecOps.
Right, right.
What exactly is that? And how does it fit into this whole picture of building a really secure and scalable IT infrastructure? DevSecOps. It kind of sounds like, one of those buzzy tech terms that gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah.
But what's the actual concept behind it? And why is it so relevant to this whole conversation about IT optimization?
Okay, so it's definitely more than just a buzzword, I can tell you that.
Okay.
It's really a fundamental shift in how we think about software development and security especially. Imagine for a second, like, a car assembly line, right?
Okay, yeah.
Instead of waiting until the very end of the line when the car is completely built to see if it runs, you'd be integrating these quality checks at every single stage of the process, right? To catch those problems early on.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's essentially what DevSecOps does for software.
Oh, interesting. So instead of treating security as this like afterthought, something you bolt on at the end, you're saying it needs to be woven into the entire fabric of the development process from the very beginning.
You got it. Exactly. It's about breaking down those silos that tend to exist between the development teams, the security teams, the operations teams, getting everybody on the same page, collaborating from day one, and then, of course, automating as many of those security measures as possible throughout that entire software lifecycle.
Which ties into this broader theme of automation that Bythors keeps bringing up, right?
Yeah.
They specifically call out something called infrastructure as code, or IAC.
IAC, it's a bit of a mouthful.
It is. It sounds intriguing, but I'll be honest, my coding skills are a little rusty, to say the least.
Yeah.
Can you break it down for those of us who aren't, expert programmers? What does that even mean? Infrastructure as code.
Okay, so think of it like writing a script, right? But instead of writing a script for a movie or a play, you're writing a script to build and manage your entire IT infrastructure.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So let's say you need to set up a brand new server, right?
Okay.
Instead of going through all these manual steps, configuring everything by hand,
Right.
you would write code that defines all of the server specifications, its security settings, the applications you want to run on it, everything.
So it's like having a digital blueprint for your IT infrastructure
Exactly.
that automates the entire process.
Precisely. And this blueprint, it's not like a one-time thing. You can store it, you can version control it, you can reuse it to spin up identical environments in a matter of minutes. And it dramatically reduces the risk of human error. It makes sure that everything is consistent across your systems, and it makes scaling your infrastructure so much easier.
Wow. And you don't necessarily need to be a coding whiz to understand the basic logic behind it, right? Like if something needs to change, you just modify the code and then the system adapts.
Exactly.
And speaking of adapting, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, or maybe it's more like the home office in the room at this point.
Yeah.
How has this whole rise of remote work impacted this like intricate world of IT? What have you seen?
It's been interesting, to say the least. It's been a blessing and a curse, really. And Bythors, actually, they push back on this myth that remote work automatically leads to people being less productive.
Right, right.
Because in a lot of cases, it's actually the opposite.
Yeah, for sure.
But that being said, it definitely introduces its own set of challenges, especially when it comes to managing a remote IT workforce.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's that classic double-edged sword of technology, right? We see it all the time. But from a purely IT perspective, what are some of the things that businesses really need to be thinking about to make sure that transition to a remote or even a hybrid work model goes smoothly and, more importantly, securely?
Well, communication is key. That's number one. Regular check-ins, even just those virtual team building activities, having really clear communication channels, all of that becomes even more important when you're not physically in the same space. Because it's easy to forget, those casual interactions that happen in an office, those water cooler conversations.
Yeah.
Those often spark so much innovation, so much problem solving. And when you're remote, you have to be much more intentional about recreating those opportunities for connection.
It's about being more deliberate about how you foster those relationships and that sense of like connection and collaboration in this virtual world.
Yes, exactly. And on the flip side of that, of course, is the security piece, which, if anything, becomes even more critical when you have everybody accessing company data from all these different locations, using all these different devices.
Yeah, absolutely, because your attack surface just expanded exponentially.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
So having those really robust security measures in place is not even optional at that point.
Right.
We're talking VPNs, we're talking multi-factor authentication, firewalls, you name it, the whole 9 yards. And, Bythors really emphasizes this too. Providing employees with company-issued devices whenever possible is just so much more secure.
Oh, yeah.
But if that's not feasible, then at least having really strict security protocols in place for personal devices.
It's about taking those same security standards that you would have in a physical office environment and extending them out to this new distributed world. And, as we kind of wrap up our deep dive here, that idea of taking this holistic view, it really sticks with me. Whether we're talking about simplifying these complex IT systems, building in that scalability from the ground up, or even just adapting to the realities of this new world of work, it's about being strategic. It's about laying that really solid foundation for the future, whatever it may hold.
I couldn't agree more. I think, if anything, the key takeaway here is that technology, it should be working for us, not the other way around. It should be making us more efficient, more secure, more adaptable, not bogging us down in all this complexity, or even worse, creating these new vulnerabilities.
Well said. And on that note, it's time for us to unplug from this deep dive into the world of IT. But here's a final thought for everyone to ponder as you navigate your own tech journeys. What if we took all of these principles, the simplification, the automation, the strategic thinking, and applied them to our own personal digital lives? What if we decluttered our inboxes the same way we decluttered those servers, automated those pesky repetitive tasks that eat up our time, maybe even rethought our whole relationship with social media? Who knows, maybe we'd unlock some surprising benefits in terms of our focus, our productivity, even our overall well-being. It's something to think about as we all continue to navigate this ever-evolving digital world. So until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.